Hello there, and welcome to episode 1 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. This is a series primarily intended for students who are studying the Edexcel Lancastrians and Yorkists unit, but it's going to take in most of the Wars of the Roses. So welcome if you're studying anything connected with that. Just a bit of housekeeping. I guess the Edexcel unit, just as a reminder, has 5 depth topics included in it and 2 breadth topics at the end, and then in the exam at the end you'll get a compulsory question on one of the breadth topics as a source question, and then a choice of 2 essays, again set from the depth questions. So 3 of the depth questions in theory will be covered out of the 5, but because you don't know which one the compulsory source question is, every depth topic has to be covered and known about and revised. And then after those 2 questions in the exam, you'll have a choice of 2 questions about the breadth topic, and we'll get to those later on. I'm going to focus on the depth topics first of all, beginning with obviously depth topic 1, which is the crisis of 1399 to 1405. And the first big question of this crisis is why, in 1399, did Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, seize the throne from Richard II? Now, because the course starts, or the unit starts in 1399, and because the depth topic starts in 1399, you won't be required or expected to have knowledge of events before 1399, but with a course question, it is really difficult to understand why Henry does something in 1399 without understanding some, at least, of the background to that. So in this episode, I'm going to outline the bigger build-up to Henry IV seizing the throne as Henry Bolingbroke in 1399 from Richard II, and hopefully tease out some of those reasons. So to start that off, we're going to wind all the way back to 1327 when Edward III became king, and he was king all the way from 1327 through to 1377, so he reigned for 50 years. And there are 3 things of note that you probably ought to bear in mind about Edward III. The first one is that he was in power when the 100 Years' War against France started. So this started in 1337, and because it's 100 years, of course, it runs through to 1453, which isn't 100 years at all. And the most important thing to remember, 2 most important things to remember about the 100 Years' War, firstly, is to get France, that's very important, and secondly, it's very expensive for England. So through this whole time, all the way up to 1453, which we're going to talk about, obviously Henry V and then Henry VI are very involved in the 100 Years' War. The tax burden on England is really big, and as a recurring theme of how do you raise the money for the war, and also how well the war's going has a big impact on particularly like the morale and the confidence of the nobility in the king. So that's the first thing about Edward III. The second thing about Edward III is that during his reign the Black Death occurs. Now that happened between 1345 and 1353, and it killed, they reckon, between about 30% and 45% of the entire population. So it's absolutely devastating. And just to quickly move past this devastation, one of the initial impacts was an increase in wages, which was great for the low-paid labourers in the country, and an increase in their living standards. But the nobility hit back at that pretty quickly in 1350, still while the Black Death was circulating, with what was called the Statute of Labourers. And that said that wages had to stay at pre-Black Death levels, and also restricted their time off from their nobility around the country. And this, of course, led to massive peasant disgruntlement, which we're going to come back to in a moment. The third thing then, after the war and the Black Death, to remember about Edward III is that Edward III had 5 sons. One of the big important things about being a monarch in this era was that you needed to have an heir, and there needed to be some sort of stability in who was going to take over. That helped make your reign more stable because people were less likely to rebel and revolt and get ideas above their station. So Edward was well stocked with sons. His eldest son was Edward, the Black Prince. Unfortunately, Edward the Black Prince died of dysentery in 1376. just a year before Edward III himself died, and that meant that his heir was Edward the Black Prince's son, Richard, Edward III's grandson, therefore. Richard was only 10 years old when he came to the throne, so despite having 5 sons, Richard II takes over, and there's a time of relative instability because of the age of Richard II. However, he was well advised when he took the throne by 2 of his uncles, John of Gaunt, and who was Duke of Lancaster, Edward III's 3rd son, and Thomas of Woodstock, Edward III's 5th son. So Uncle John and Uncle Thomas were his key advisors. Now, when Richard became king, as a 10-year-old with these 2 advisors, he needed to raise money for the war because that was going badly. So Parliament gave permission for a poll tax, a tax on each person, to be raised 3 times in 4 years. This was seen not so much as being Richard's fault, but John of Gaunt's fault, the Duke of Lancaster, Uncle John, who was running the show. And this directly led to the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. The peasants were already upset at being suppressed after the Black Death, and now they were being taxed heavily as well. The Peasants' Revolt, led by Wat Tyler, famously comes to London, runs amok, and eventually Uncle John of Gaunt is nowhere to be seen at this time. He's off somewhere else. It is faced down by 14-year-old Richard II. Here was his first instance of him acting on his own initiative. Very bravely goes out to meet the leaders. He seems quite gracious and mature in promising pardons and promising to look into their grievances, the peasants, and the peasants disperse, go back home, and everything's kind of happy and settled for about a week. And then literally 2 weeks later, Richard II goes back on his word. He has the ringleaders of the Peasant Revolt chased down and executed. And this is mentioned really because not only is it Richard II's kind of first defining moment as monarch, at the moment he steps out from behind his advisors' cloaks, but also it provides a little bit of an insight into Richard II's character, that notion of pardoning, but then going back on a word and an act of revenge comes up again. So, winding on a little bit, there were troubles in the 1380s between Richard and Parliament. There was the war against France wasn't going very well. There was a feeling that Richard II wasn't really committed to it. He also fell out with John of Gaunt, Uncle John, on a campaign in Scotland where John wanted to push on into Scotland beyond Edinburgh, and Richard didn't want to go any further. John leaves at that point for Castile, in modern-day Spain, for several years, and Richard II therefore is left running the show on his own and promotes several of his friends to key positions. And this, because things aren't going very well, this causes problems with Parliament. So in 1386, what was known as the Wonderful Parliament met, and they were meeting to grant taxation for the war to Richard, but they refused to grant any taxation until key positions were sorted out by Richard, including the Chancellor, who was the first English politician to be impeached. Parliament was led in this by 5 lords. These were Thomas of Woodstock, who was Richard II's uncle and erstwhile advisor, and then the Earls of Arundel, Warwick, and Tom Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham, as well as Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby at this time. Henry Bolingbroke, is John of Gaunt's son and heir, although John of Gaunt's still alive at this time. Just like with the Peasants' Revolt, Richard II seemed to give ground to these 5 lords and forgive them and pardon them, but then went off and raised an army and came back with them to face them down at the Battle of Radcut Bridge. However, at the Battle of Radcut Bridge, Richard II's supporters are defeated, and he is forced to accept the removal of his friends from key positions. Parliament imposes new advisors. So Richard is put in his place in the 1380s. At the end of the 1380s, John of Gaunt returns from Castile, and everything kind of seems to be settling down. One other thing to mention at this stage is that in 1394, Richard II's wife, Anne of Bohemia, died without having provided an heir. And this, of course, is key to the story moving on. One of the reasons that Henry Bolingbroke is able to usurp the throne is because there is no heir that the nobility are committed to. Richard II seemed really affected by the death of his wife in a touching way. It seems to have been quite a happy marriage. But eventually he agreed to remarry in order to provide an heir. And he agrees to remarry Isabella, the daughter of King Charles VI of France. The fly in the ointment here is that Isabella was only 7 years old at the time. Some places say 6 years old, but basically very, very young, a child. There wouldn't be any consummation until she reached puberty, and that was obviously some years off. And let's not get into thinking about the discrepancy in age, which is about 20 years or so anyway. All this meant that there was not going to be an heir to the throne in England for quite some time. And one of the other parts of the deal was that there was going to be a 28-year truce with France, and that was kind of unpopular with the nobility too, who were broadly speaking behind the 100 Years' War. With no heir on the throne, in the meantime, Richard II's heir was Roger Mortimer, who was grandson of Edward III's second son, Lionel, who had also died. So Edward III had 5 sons. First son, Black Prince, he had died, leaving Richard as king. The second son, Lionel, had died, leaving Roger Mortimer as his heir. So although Roger Mortimer was heir, actually John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was the most powerful man in the land after Richard II. So he becomes something of a threat to Richard at this time. In the 1390s, Richard II appears to grow more tyrannical. And this is not such a surprise if we look at his history of the Peasants' Revolt and his reaction to the Parliament in 1386. But he started parading around with a very large retinue of about 700 archers, making a bit of a point about how powerful he was. And then in July 1397, he acts to take revenge on the first part of revenge on the 5 lords that had rebelled against him in 1386, or had forced him to accept the impeachment of his friend. 3 of them were arrested of the 5 and tried for treason. They are Warwick and Arundel, and Thomas of Woodstock, his uncle. Warwick was imprisoned, Arundel was executed, and Thomas died in Calais, probably murdered while under arrest. Henry Bolingbroke and his dad, John of Gaunt, backed Richard II at this time in his actions as king, but it seems like in the few years after that, Bolingbroke became increasingly nervous, and then he actually got into a dispute in a sort of very exciting moment for Richard II. Henry Bolingbroke got into a dispute with Tom Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham from previously, but now the Duke of Norfolk. These are the 2 remaining of the 5 rebels. And this is ideal for Richard II because he was able to act against both of his 2 remaining enemies as he saw them, deal with them. So Bolingbroke was exiled for 10 years. Tom Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, was banished for life. However, Richard II then pushed things even further, and even though he was in exile, Henry Bolingbroke could inherit when his father died. But when John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard II blocks that inheritance and does not allow Henry Bolingbroke to claim it. This is what tips Henry Bolingbroke over the edge. Up till now, he's been kind of able to work with Richard II at times. He's been a bit nervous at times, but broadly speaking, has accepted his authority. Now he is against him, and so he turns to the King of France's brother, the Duke of Orleans, and creates a bit of an alliance with him, a bit of a pact with him, and this is to rebel against him. And next time, I think we'll have a look at how Henry Bolingbroke seizes power and what the causes of that were. I hope that's helpful. See you next time.